Sorry. We're back for the next part of MVP Day, Israel, the DevOps track, and I'm happy to welcome Thomas Vochten. I hope I said it correctly. Technology evangelist and Microsoft MVP. Hi, Thomas.
Hi, how are you? I'm really happy to be
Great.
here. It's my first time, well, I would say speaking in Israel, but speaking, virtually in Israel. So yeah, happy to be here.
Thank you, and thank you for joining us. Tell us about your session today.
Yes, so I am not much of a developer. I know we're in the DevOps track, but I set out on a mission to teach IT professionals, so people who are not really developers like myself, to teach them about Git and GitHub, because I think that's a basic skill that almost everyone in the technology profession should know these days. So that's why, yeah.
Totally agree. So I think it's time to start. So your stage is yours, Thomas. Thank you.
All right, perfect. So with a little bit of luck, you will be able to see my screen. So I hope you will shout if that's not the case. I only have one monitor today, so it's a little bit of a handicap, but I'm sure we'll manage. All right. So getting started with Git and GitHub for the reluctant IT pro. Like I said in the introduction, it's a little bit of maybe a developer topic, but I'm not a developer myself, as I already said. I know my way around Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code. I do a lot of PowerShell, stuff like that, but I'm by no means a real developer. But still, if you're in the technology profession nowadays, it's probably a very good idea to learn at least the basics of Git and GitHub. To be able to do your job properly, especially if you're in the Microsoft space. Well, not only in the Microsoft space, but if you're working with Azure or Office 365, there are a lot of community projects which make use of Git, or well, I would have to say GitHub, to publish codes for you to download or even to contribute if you want. But we're going to talk about that later on in the presentation. So on the agenda, we only have 30 minutes, so that's quite challenging. As you will see, Git can be quite complicated or can get complicated quite fast. So we'll be able to cover the basics today. So it's going to be an introductory session. If you have been working with Git or GitHub, but especially Git for already a lot of like months or years, you probably will not find anything new in this session. So it's an introductory session. After the introduction, we'll talk about the tools you need to get started, because we're geeks. We like to use tools. And I'll tell you exactly what you need to get started with Git and GitHub and how to work with all these interesting tools. Then I'll demonstrate you the most basic stuff and how do you get that done with Git. So downloading code from the internet and contributing back, that's the demonstration. And then I'll give you finally some pointers on where to go next, because there is a lot to learn about Git and GitHub. And we'll give you some pointers on maybe interesting projects that you can contribute to, or how you would go about and embark on a Git learning journey, because there are many more topics to discover. All right, just a little bit about myself. I'm Thomas Vochten. I'm an MVP, which basically means I like talking a lot. I'm based in Belgium, so it's a little bit further away from Israel. We're also, and there is also an hour time difference. I'm the president of BIWIG, which is the Belgian Information Worker User Group. And that's a user group in Belgium where we do monthly meetings around mostly Microsoft 365, but also some Azure topics. And I'm working for the Kronos Group, which is a large technology group in Belgium. The best way to reach me, if you've got any questions afterwards, there is, of course, the possibility to ask questions in the chat. But if you've got any additional questions afterwards, the best way to reach me is probably through Twitter. So I'm a fairly active Twitterer, so you can easily reach me there. Or if you want, you can even send me an email if you want to. Okay, introduction to Git. If you've seen people use Git or talk about Git or talk about GitHub, it looks all very, very developer-y. And it probably is. It also has its origins in the developer world, and it's still today primarily a developer topic, right? That's we have to be honest. Like I said, I don't consider myself to be a real developer. I do a lot of PowerShell, so that's probably code too. But why do we have a tool like Git? Why would we care? I think that's a very important question to answer. If we look back at how we as IT professionals treat maybe scripts like PowerShell scripts or any other assets that we create for customers, we have to store them somewhere. If that's a document, that might be on a file share, or that might be in a SharePoint repository somewhere, and SharePoint document library, in OneDrive, Dropbox, you name it, it's all possible. But that's not necessarily the best way to store code. And when I say code in this session, I also mean scripts like PowerShell scripts. It doesn't have to be JavaScript or C#, or it's just any asset that you want to store and that you want to work with in a later phase. A good example is this. If you look at the graphic here, this is an example of a PowerShell script. Now, it started out as on the first line there as script underscore to do underscore stuff PS1, so normal PowerShell script. Then we work on the script, and then we say, okay, we need to introduce a new feature in the script, or I have to change something. So what do? You copy the script, you rename it, you do a v2, and you've got your second version. And then we say, well, the second version is quite handy. It works quite well. Let's use that at a certain customer. Okay, v2-customer a.ps1. You know the drill, right? So we end up with a lot of different iterations of the script with different names and different contents. And in the end, it's one big mess because you don't know, okay, when did we introduce that feature? When did we change that? Which is the customer specific file? It's all very chaotic. And that's not what we want. And where do you store these files? Well, I said on a file share on your laptop. That's could be something. But if you want to share your code or your script with someone else, with your colleagues or I don't know who, well, you have to put it somewhere. I'm personally guilty of storing a lot of scripts in my OneNote file. I don't do that anymore, by the way, but I have been guilty on doing that. But yeah, you can store scripts everywhere if you want. The problem is when you've got a lot of them, when they change, or when you have to work together with other people. Because how on earth, if I created script version 3, how on earth does someone else know what is in the script? Well, you can open it, but what are the difference between the last version or the next version, and etc. So it's really, really, really complicated. Now, developers had this problem for a long time already, and they developed some good practices or best practices to work with code and using source control, because that's what it is. Using source control is one of these practices that should be known by everyone, even if you're not a developer. And that's what this session is about. So working together. So source control already exists for a lot of years. I've used different source control versions or source control systems in the past. I've used Subversion a few years ago, well, a lot of years ago. I used Team Foundation Server from Microsoft. I even used Visual Source Save back in the days. I don't want to be remembered about Visual Source Save, but there are a lot of systems available for doing source control. And all these systems, they basically provide more or less the same functionality. You get versioning for your files, so you know what changed. You can track different changes and versions. That's quite important already. I think that ability in itself is already worthwhile for using source control. The ability to go back if you messed up, which happens a lot, of course. So you open a script file, you change something, or you change a lot, and it appears it doesn't really work. Well, no, let's start over. Instead of erasing everything and trying to figure out, okay, where were we before we tried to make these changes? You can just I would say with one press of a button, it's not really true, but with a few keystrokes, you can just go back to the previous version of the script. That's quite cool. It enables you to work together with other people, because using source control, you can even work on the same file, on the same script or the same code file with your colleagues or with other people, evil people on the internet, if you want, if you're using an open source repository like GitHub. So that's all possible. It's very interesting, but it can also be, well, a little bit complicated. Some of the more maybe complicated features is what we call branching. That means that source control works with branches. So you have your main branch or your master branch. Most people use master. I like to use main these days. So you've got your master branch, which contains the, let's call it, the production version of your code. And whenever you want to make changes, you want to fix a bug, or you want to introduce something new, you create a separate branch. It's like a tree. And you're able to work on that branch for your new feature or to fix a bug, and later on pull those changes back into the main production line of code. It sounds all very complicated, but it's quite neat, and that's also one of the main benefits of using source control. You can just branch off into something else, do your stuff, try to make something work, introduce a new feature, and when you think, okay, it's okay, we can merge back into the main or master repository. So that's quite cool. And if you're working on such a new feature and people change the production code, you can even merge that code into your feature. So that's quite cool. Sounds a little bit complicated, I know. If you're just starting out with Git, it's maybe not the first thing you will try, but it's quite cool. Now, the de facto standard these days for using source control is a tool called Git. Git is free, it's open source, but the magic word on this slide is distributed. And that's also what it sets it apart from many other source control systems. Because you have to install Git on your personal PC, but you can also work with Git in what we call a remote repository like GitHub or many other systems. So Git is free. You can just go to the URL and download Git, install it on your PC, and you're, well, in principle, you're already set. You can begin to use your source control system on your own PC. But it's only powerful if you use together with other people. And also, if they install Git, you have to have a kind of central repository to work with. And that's the distributed part of Git. Like I said, there are other source control systems, but this is the de facto standard. I think that almost everyone uses Git these days. Now, what about GitHub? Because Git and GitHub is not the same. GitHub is basically Git, like you would install it on your laptop, but hosted centrally by Microsoft in this case. GitHub was a standalone company, got acquired by Microsoft in 2018, and it's just a hosted version of Git. That means that you can also store code in GitHub. You can store code on your laptop. You can synchronize the two and work together, and you can use it as a, let's say, central source control repository. You've got private repos, you've got public repos if you want to share something with other people, open source, that's possible. Git is also implemented by a few other providers like Bitbucket or GitLab, and even by Microsoft in its own system, Azure Repos, which is part of Azure DevOps. That's also Git, or you can also use Git there. It's not the same as GitHub. That's quite an interesting evolution, actually, because it remains to be seen what Microsoft will do with Azure Repos now that they bought Git and GitHub, and doing a lot of interesting stuff with it. So that's GitHub. So Git is the tool itself. GitHub is the hosted version of that tool, of that source control system in the cloud. Now, I'll give you a few seconds to look at this graph while I'll take a sip of my coffee. You probably haven't read it completely right now, but it just means, it basically says, well, Git is complicated, right? If you start out with Git and you start working with code or with PowerShell scripts, and you don't even have to use code, you can also use documents, and I'm going to show you that in a demonstration. It can get complicated in the beginning. And well, not even in the beginning, if you're already used to work with Git after a few months or even years. Many people tell me, well, sometimes you end up in these situations that you just want to erase everything and start all over. That's what this graphic is about. But usually there is always a way out of those kind of trouble. If you're just working by yourself and you're storing your code in a Git repository and you're working with it, you won't end up with that much trouble. Especially if you're working with lots of people, it can be quite complicated. It can be so complicated that some people thought, well, that's a good idea, and they created a website. This website is called Oh Shit Git, and it lists a number of situations, or very common situations, where you might end up with and how to revert back. So let's say you are working on something and you erased everything. How do I go back? you worked on a new feature and you're committed it to a wrong branch, for example. How do I make that work? Stuff like that. If you think, oh shit, Git is a little bit too offensive, there is an alternative page which is called Dang It Git, which is a little bit of less of strong language. And there's even a Hebrew version. Now, I don't know Hebrew, so I hope this is suitable, what is on this page, but that should be a neatly translated version of the Dang It Git page. So there is something for everyone. Okay, so the setup or the tools you need to get started. We talked about the principles, about Git, GitHub, and how they relate to each other. Okay, what do we need on our PC to do anything interesting with it? What I use, and there are many possibilities, what I use are these 3 tools, all from not from Microsoft, but mainly in the Microsoft sphere. So you have to install Git itself. We already talked about that. You have to install it on your PC. And when you install Git on your PC, you have a fully working source control system already on your laptop or workstation. So you don't have to use a hosted or a server component or something. It's not needed, unlike some other source control systems. So you install Git, and then, of course, you need to work with it. What I do is I use Git inside of Windows Terminal. Windows Terminal, if you're an attendee at this conference, you hopefully already heard about Windows Terminal. It's the better command prompt that Microsoft released. It's free. You can get it in the Microsoft Store or through GitHub. Again, one of the reasons GitHub is there to share open source code. So Windows Terminal, and you can also use Visual Studio Code if you want. Now, again, I'm not a developer, but I still use Visual Studio Code because it has very neat Git integration, and you can also work with PowerShell there. So that's quite cool. So if you've installed these 3 components, there is usually an additional step you will want to do, especially in Windows Terminal, and that is enable Git integration. By default, if you open Windows Terminal, you will just get, I think the default is PowerShell these days, you will just get a PowerShell prompt, nothing fancy. But you might have seen this already when people work with Git or GitHub. They have these really fancy, colorful PowerShell prompts or command prompts, and that's a customization. It's not built in Windows Terminal, but it's something that is really neat because in this case it will show you through the use of icons and colors. And I've got 2 examples here. What you need to do or what you need to remember when you're working with Git. For example, the first one, the green one, tells us that we are in the main branch. I told you about branches in the beginning, and that was the production branch usually. By the way, this is just a convention. You can name it whatever you want, but in this case, it's called main. It's green, and we don't have anything to do. That's basically what this says. You're okay. In the second line, it's orange. We're still in main, but we see these little symbols there. This basically means you've changed the file. One file. That's if you add a file or if you delete a file from that directory, it will look a little bit different. But you're immediately able to see, okay, oh, I still need to. I say save, but it's called committing my code to the repository, or I need to do something else, or it gives a visual indication. Very neat, and almost everyone uses this. To do this in PowerShell and Windows Terminal, you need to follow a little procedure. So of course you need Windows Terminal, and then you need to install what is called a PowerLine capable font. Now PowerLine enables all the little icons that you see on the screen. That's and a good collection of PowerLine capable fonts can be found free, by the way, on Nerd Fonts. That's a good repository to go there. Once you get hold of a font that you like, you have to change your prompt in PowerShell, and that's done through 2 PowerShell modules that you can download from the PowerShell gallery. First one is Posh Git, PowerShell Git integration, and Oh My Posh. And Oh My Posh makes sure that your prompt looks nice. And then with the set theme command, you're able to. There are multiple themes, and this is just an example. You're able to make your prompt a little bit prettier. And then in the end, you change your Windows Terminal settings to use that font, so it becomes available. I've included a link to the whole procedure at the end of my presentation. I will share my slides afterwards, so you don't have to take screenshots or something. I have the procedure lined up for you later on. So we talked about command line tools, and many people like to use the command line tools. But in the beginning, when you're starting out, it can be quite intimidating because it's command line. Now, Git is quite good. It gives you a lot of suggestions when to do something or when not to do something and how you can do the things better. But sometimes you just want to go to a nice user interface. And there is a tool available from GitHub that enables you to work with Git repositories and GitHub, of course, which is called GitHub Desktop. So I'm not going to use that in my demonstration, but that's something you might want to try, especially for bigger repositories. Like I said, there is a nice integration with Visual Studio Code 2. So almost everything that we saw in the command line with this pretty prompt is also possible in Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code has built-in Git integration, so it will give you a nice indication of when you changed something. Do I still need to commit something? Do I need to push it to the remote repository? That's all nicely integrated. And you can make it even better by using some extensions. And these are the ones I use, Git Lens, Git History, and GitHub Pull Requests and Issues. Those are 3 free extensions that you can install in Visual Studio Code to make your experience even better. And it enables you, for example, Git Lens enables you to go on a line in, for example, in your code or your PowerShell, and then it will tell you automatically, okay, this line has been changed by that person so many weeks ago, etc., etc. It enables some nice integration. But that's absolutely something you should check out. All right, the basic stuff with Git. And don't get me wrong, I dumbed it down a little bit because it's not, 100% correct, maybe, but this is a good slide to get you acquainted with the basics of Git. You hear people talking about cloning, and that means downloading code from the internet, basically. There is forking. Forking means I want to change something, but I want to change it in my own copy of the code. That's called forking. So you copy something to your own repository to make some changes. There is branching. I think we talked about that already. So creating a separate area to work on something, a bug, a feature, doesn't matter. Once you're working with the source control system, you have to, let's call it saving in or checking in your changes. That's called committing. You can also push. That means what I've changed locally on my PC still needs to get published to GitHub. That's pushing. Then we have pulling. Let's say you're working with something on your local PC, but someone changed something centrally, that you need to pull those changes down. That's pulling. And you can also merge. That means 2 people make changes and they have to come back together. So that's the merging, and that's a big part of the distributed aspect of Git. Now, many of these practices are just conventions. Some of these things are not enforced by the tool. We talked about the main branch or the master branch. That's just a convention. Everyone uses master or main. And there are some other conventions also enabled here. So not everything that you read about Git is also enforced through the tool. Okay, we only have got like 7 minutes left, so it's maybe time to still do some kind of demonstration. So what we're going to do now is because that's a very common scenario. If you start out with Git, you get a URL. Someone says, okay, get that code from GitHub. That's what you hear all the time. So let me illustrate you how that might look like. So people give you a URL and you end up somewhere on GitHub. In this case, my own home on GitHub, and this one is pointing to a presentations repository, the repository where I keep my presentations, and then you've got different files here. You've got folders and files, and if you click through these folders, you will get a PDF version of slides that I published. Right? There is also a README file with some information. Okay. How do I, let's say this is code, how do I work with this code? And that is something you do by cloning. There will be a button here, code, and then you have this URL here. You just copy the URL with this button. I won't bother you with the other options here. And then you've got Windows Terminal that I installed too. Like you see, I've made it a little bit prettier than the default, and I'm in the dev folder, and I've got already a few directories in my dev folder. But I wanna work with this repository that I got on GitHub, and then the command, like we said, is git cloning, git clone, and then you just paste the URL of the repository. Press enter. Now, this is not a big repository, so it won't take that much time, hopefully. So, right, it's already downloaded. And then you do it here again. And then you see I've got a presentations folder. Let's switch to the presentations folder. Let me clear my screen. And then you see that the prompt changed. So it recognizes we're on GitHub. It knows we're in the main branch. And the 3 stripes here means everything is OK. We don't need to do anything. That's quite cool. If you want to know what's going on about your repository without looking at these icons, you can also do git status at every time, and it says, okay, you're on the branch main, and it's up to date with the origin. The origin, again, is a convention, which means the remote repository on GitHub. There's nothing wrong here. Everything is okay. Okay, let's change something. Let's add some code, and I've prepared the slides from today in a folder where I'm going with Windows Explorer. I'm going to put that in there. By the way, if you go to Windows Explorer, and I just copied in this this file here, you will see a .git directory. It's a hidden directory. Never ever touch this because you will break the system. So that's quite important. Let's go back to terminal. Let's do enter, and you will see that the prompt changed. It recognizes that I did something. So if I do git status, we're still on the main branch, but we have an untracked file. I just dropped a file in Windows Explorer, but it's not included into the source control system yet. So it knows that something changed, but it's not tracking it because it says, okay, it might be a mistake. So we have to add this file, or this directory in this case, to GitHub. You can specify the name of the file, but you can also do dots or an asterisk, and then you're tracking everything. The prompt changed again. All right, let's do git status again. All right. What it says now is, well, you have a change to be committed. So we're tracking it. You might still make some changes, but if you're done, you have to save your changes to the source control system. And that's something you do with git commit. You always have to give a message. Let's say MVP days Israel, because that's what the slides are about. You commit, and it changes it on the local repository. It doesn't save it in GitHub yet. That's local change. All right, let's do git status again. And everything is okay. We don't have to do anything. Besides, if you look at the icon here, it says #1 and an arrow here. It means you still need to upload that change to GitHub, because if you go to GitHub and we refresh the page, well, it's not here yet, right? So we have to still push it, git push, and it will automatically push my PDF file to the GitHub repository. Might take a while. Okay, now we again have 3 stripes here, which means it's okay. And if we refresh the page, we see that my slides for today are available on GitHub for you to download if you want. So that's those are the basic principles. Now, if you're working with a repository where also other people work, you can also do git pull, and that will make sure that all the changes, it's not going to do anything now because we didn't change anything, but if someone else would check in changes on GitHub and you will not know about it, you still have to do a git pull to get those changes also in your local repository. So that's those are really the absolute basic commands. Yeah, this is a small lame joke about commit messages, because yeah, the good practice is to commit your changes often, and then you still have to work out all these commit messages. Okay, we're not going to talk about that. This is a slide for your information, which illustrates how you can start out from scratch, because we started out from something that is already available, my presentations repository. So that's something else. All right, before we stop, where to go next, what to learn next? First of all, you have to really know how working with these remote repositories goes. And so are we working with GitHub? How does that work? What about pull and push? What about branching? What about forking, merging, pull requests? Those are the more, let's say, advanced topics. Well, I guess the only really advanced topic is merging and pull requests. The rest is quite well, it's not, I wouldn't say simple, but not that difficult. Let me skip a few illustration slides because we are at the end. There is still some time for questions, I guess, but okay, what you need to take away from this session, again, sorry, we only had 30 minutes, but getting started with Git is relatively simple, but it can become quite complicated once you go beyond the basics. So learn how to use it, create a separate GitHub repository and work with that so you don't mess up someone else's work. Don't be afraid of the command line, but know that there are also tools that will be able to help you. For example, GitHub Desktop and Visual Studio Code. We stayed in the command line, but you don't have to. And then commit, push, pull as often as you can to make sure everything is synchronized. And don't stop here. Absolutely continue learning. These are some additional resources. They're also published on the slides, of course, that we just uploaded. And if you want to go to that GitHub repository, you can use this QR code where you will end up directly at the repository we just published. Okay, I want to thank you for your attention. And if there are any questions through the chat, for example, I guess the moderator will also jump in now.
Thank you, Thomas. It was a very interesting session. I see a question about what are good open source projects that we can contribute to.
Yeah, that's a good question. There is actually a lot. If you would just go to github.com, for example, you will automatically, and you will create a profile, you will see a lot of potential projects. And don't be mistaken, you don't have to be a coder. For example, if you go to docs.microsoft.com, so the official Microsoft documentation, that is also all stored in GitHub. So if you see a problem with the Microsoft documentation, you don't have to sit and wait. No, you can just work with the documentation and what we call do a pull request to change something. So you can just change the documentation, issue a pull request towards Microsoft, and of course they will review it, and then you can have your own documentation end up, or you can on the Microsoft Docs website. I did that multiple times already. It takes a few minutes. You don't even have to use the command line tools. So the docs.microsoft.com website has some Git integration built in. It's a little bit different, but it's not really. It's not hard. Something else is if you're working with PowerShell, for example, there are so many interesting PowerShell repositories, open source, available, like Pester, which is a testing framework, stuff like that. There are many possibilities. And what I recently started contributing to is Winget. So I don't know if you've heard about Winget already. Winget is the package manager by Microsoft, or the software installation tool by Microsoft. So you don't have to go to a website to install Visual Studio Code. You can just do Winget install VS Code, and then it will automatically install that. But you can also contribute your own packages. So if you're reinstalling your PC and you find, okay, I have to go and look for a certain executable somewhere on the internet, and I always forget where it is, well, you can, with one simple file, you can create your own package, submit that to Winget, and in the next time you can just do Winget install your own software, and then it will get installed. So there are many, many possibilities. Microsoft also has an open source page with a list of projects to contribute to, and also in the Azure space there is a lot. Yeah, if you just go to GitHub or any Microsoft community site, you will find a lot of examples. Yeah.
So great, thank you, Thomas. And we will go to the break and come back with another session. So thank you, Thomas.
Very good. Okay, thanks for having me. If you've got any other changes, people know where to find me. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, great.
Bye.
Thank you.